The frost-covered fields of Belgium lay silent under a December dawn in 1944. Inside his Sherman tank, Sergeant William Patterson watched his loader, Private James McCarthy, slide another round into the 76mm gun's breech. The metallic clang echoed through the cramped turret as McCarthy stepped back, his breath visible in the frigid air. Patterson knew what round sat waiting in that chamber. The tungsten core inside the M93 shell represented America's answer to German armor superiority. But what neither he nor the Panther crew, 300 yards distant yet understood, was the brutal mathematics of the next few seconds. When Patterson fired, his muzzle blast would kick up a wall of snow and frozen earth that would blind him for 8 to 30 seconds. In that window, if the Panther crew survived his shot, they would have exactly enough time to traverse their gun, acquire his position through the dissipating cloud, and fire back. The German crew inside that Panther had been trained to believe their frontal armor was impenetrable to American tank guns. Patterson's tungsten round was about to shatter that belief, but the dust cloud his gun created meant he might not survive long enough to confirm the kill. This tactical paradox, this deadly race between ballistics and visibility, would define armored combat in the final months of the European War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American tank crews found themselves trapped in this desperate calculus begins not on frozen Belgian battlefields, but in the industrial facilities and testing grounds where ordnance engineers wrestled with a problem that threatened to undermine the entire American armored offensive in Europe. In early 1944, American military planners confronted an intelligence failure of staggering 5 proportions. The M4 Sherman tank, which had proven more than adequate against German armour in North Africa and the early stages of the Italian campaign, was encountering tanks in Normandy it simply could not defeat from any frontal angle. The Panther, Germany's response to the Soviet T-34, combined a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun with an 80mm glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees. This created an effective thickness, approaching 140mm, that standard American tank ammunition could not penetrate. The 75mm M3 gun that armed most Shermans in Normandy fired armor-piercing rounds at approximately 2,000 feet per second. These rounds simply bounced off the Panther's sloped frontal armor, leaving Sherman crews vulnerable to return fire from guns that could destroy them from over 2,000 yards away. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, 38% of German tanks in the theatre were Panthers. Not the handful that intelligence had predicted, but hundreds of these advanced medium tanks. Even when crewed by inexperienced soldiers pulled from training schools with minimal preparation, the Panther's armor made it nearly immune to frontal attack by standard American weapons. The psychological impact on American tank crews was immediate and severe. Crews nicknamed their Shermans the Ronson lighter, claiming they lit on fire every time. While post-war analysis showed this reputation was exaggerated, the perception shaped tactical behavior. Tank commanders who spotted Panthers often chose to call for artillery or air support rather than engage directly, yielding initiative to an enemy who could be defeated with proper ammunition and tactics, if only that ammunition existed. The United States Army had recognized the potential need for improved anti-tank ammunition well before D-Day. Since spring 1942, Ordnance Department engineers had been testing sub-caliber projectiles that used tungsten carbide cores to improve penetration. The principle was elegant. A dense tungsten core surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body concentrated kinetic energy into a smaller penetrator while reducing overall projectile weight. The result was dramatically higher muzzle velocity, where standard M62 armor-piercing rounds left the 76mm gun at 792 meters per second. The experimental T4 round achieved 1,036 meters per second. This velocity increase of 244 meters per second translated directly into penetrating power, but translating laboratory results into combat-ready ammunition that could reach frontline units in sufficient quantities proved far more difficult than developing the technology itself. The challenge was tungsten. This strategic material, critical to machine tools, armor plate hardening, and numerous industrial processes, came primarily from China, which produced 36% of global supply before the war. Every 76mm HVAP round required approximately 0.8 kilograms of tungsten carbide. A Sherman carrying just 6 HVAP rounds consumed nearly 5 kilograms of this scarce material. China produced approximately 10,000 metric tons of tungsten concentrates in 1944, but this had to serve all Allied needs across all applications. The United States supplemented Chinese imports with domestic production from limited deposits in Colorado, Nevada, and California, but total availability remained constrained. Germany's tungsten position was far worse. Swedish imports declined sharply as the war turned against the Reich. By 1945, German factories desperately hoarded tungsten for machine tools needed for aircraft engine production, while Panther crews received only standard ammunition with no specialized rounds whatsoever. American production of HVAP ammunition began scaling up only after the Normandy landings revealed the full extent of the Panther problem. In July 1944, production of 3-inch HVAP rounds for tank destroyers reached 1,000 rounds total. August saw 1,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP produced. September yielded another 1,076mm rounds. Not until November 1944 did monthly production reach 5,000 rounds for the 76mm gun, ramping to 7,000 rounds per month by January 1945. By March 1945, approximately 33,000 rounds of 76mm HVAP ammunition had been produced. This represented a significant industrial effort, but remained a fraction of what frontline units needed. The allocation system, managed at multiple command levels from army down to battalion, resulted in chronic shortages and inefficiencies. Some units received more HVAP than they could immediately use, while others exhausted their supply within days and found resupply requests going unfulfilled despite urgent need. By February 1945, the average 76mm Sherman in Europe had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds, 5 rounds to face an enemy deploying Panthers as the standard tank in Panzer divisions. A Sherman company with 17 tanks would possess 85 HVAP rounds total, while potentially facing German units that might field 30 or more Panthers. Tank destroyer units, whose mission focused specifically on anti-tank combat, received preferential allocation. Sherman tanks, with their dual role of supporting infantry and engaging armor, often received fewer rounds despite encountering enemy tanks more frequently. The first HVAP rounds reached the European theatre in August 1944, arriving at a moment when American armor was finally breaking out of Normandy's confining hedgerows into more open terrain. But the ammunition arrived with minimal training materials. Many crews learned effective employment techniques through trial and error under combat conditions, sometimes with tragic results. The tungsten carbide core, while excellent at penetrating armor when conditions were favorable, was inherently brittle. Below certain impact velocities, approximately 2,300 to 2,500 feet per second, the core could shatter on contact rather than penetrating. This meant HVAP effectiveness declined significantly at longer ranges where velocity had decreased through air resistance. The effective range against Panther mantlets was approximately 1,000 meters. Beyond this distance, the probability of the core shattering on impact increased substantially. But even more problematic than the limited supply or the technical limitations of the tungsten core was a flaw inherent in the 76mm gun itself. The high muzzle velocity that gave HVAP rounds their penetrating power came with a devastating tactical cost. The 76mm gun produced a massive muzzle blast. In dry conditions, this blast kicked up enormous dust clouds. In winter conditions, it threw up walls of snow and frozen earth. Contemporary reports documented that these obscurations took 8 to 30 seconds to clear sufficiently for the gunner to reacquire the target and assess the results of his shot. 8 to 30 seconds. In tank combat, where engagements often occurred at ranges under 1,000 yards and frequently much closer, 8 seconds represented an eternity. During those 8 seconds, the Sherman crew sat blind, unable to see if their shot had penetrated. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, Hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Unable to observe if the enemy tank was traversing its gun toward them, unable to take evasive action if needed. The Panther, by contrast, could reload its 75mm KWK-42 gun in approximately 6 seconds under combat conditions. British motion studies of captured Panthers demonstrated that loaders could achieve this rate of fire consistently when drawing from the most accessible ammunition racks. If a Sherman's HVAP round failed to achieve a catastrophic kill, if it penetrated but failed to detonate stored ammunition or incapacitate the crew, the Panther crew had a window of opportunity. They could reload, traverse their gun toward the last known position of the Sherman now hidden behind its own dust cloud, and fire before the American gunner could see clearly enough to take a follow-up shot. This created a tactical situation where American tank commanders had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. Fire the precious HVAP round at maximum effective range and risk the tungsten core shattering on impact, close to point-blank distance where penetration was more certain but the Panther's gun was equally lethal. Accept blindness for 8 to 30 seconds after firing and hope the first shot achieved a kill. September 19th, 1944. The morning fog shrouded the rolling terrain around Aracourt, France. First Lieutenant Merwin Men of the 37th Tank Battalion gripped his Sherman's turret rim as his gunner peered through the periscope, scanning the mist-covered ground ahead. They had been warned about Panthers. The formidable German tanks, whose sloped armour had proven nearly impervious to standard American shells, now dominated this sector. What Men and his crew understood, unlike the Sherman crews who had fought through Normandy without it, was that tucked into their ammunition rack were 6 rounds that would rewrite the tactical calculus of this engagement. 6 M93 high-velocity armour-piercing rounds, each containing a tungsten carbide core capable of transforming their medium Sherman into what German tankers would soon fear as an unexpected threat. But they also understood the cost. Every time they fired one of those precious rounds, they would be blind for critical seconds while the muzzle blast dissipated. The Battle of Aracourt would become the largest tank engagement fought by American forces until the Battle of the Bulge. More importantly, it would demonstrate what happened when American crews with HVAP ammunition met Panthers in terrain that allowed them to employ combined arms tactics effectively. German High Command had assembled 2 newly formed Panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, equipped primarily with Panther tanks fresh from German factories. The 113th Panzer Brigade alone entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns across both battalions, including 42 Panthers and 40 Panzer IVs. On paper, the German advantage appeared overwhelming. The 2 brigades together fielded approximately 150 tanks against Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, which possessed roughly 50 Sherman tanks, German planners, that anticipated a rapid victory. The Panther's technical superiority should compensate for any American advantages in logistics or air support. They were fundamentally mistaken about what determined outcomes in armoured combat. The morning of September 19th began with thick fog blanketing the terrain. German reconnaissance was limited. The Panzer brigades, lacking proper scouting units, advanced blindly into ground held by American forces who knew the terrain and had established defensive positions. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, elements of the 113th Panzer Brigade penetrated American outposts east and south of Aracourt. The German tanks, factory new Panthers with inexperienced crews, moved forward in column formation. This was a tactical error that veteran American tankers would immediately exploit. Captain Kenneth R. Lameson's C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, held positions along key approaches to Aracourt. His Sherman crews had been thoroughly briefed on the HVAP rounds in their ammunition racks. 6 rounds per tank. Use them wisely, the briefing had emphasized, against Panther turrets or mantlets at ranges where velocity remained sufficient for penetration. A section of Lameson's Shermans occupied positions south of the village when the first Panther materialized from the mist, barely 75 meters away. At this range, the Panther's superior long-range gunnery meant nothing. The visibility that limited both sides equally suddenly became an American advantage. The American gunner fired instantly. The HVAP round, traveling at over 1,000 meters per second, struck the Panther's gun mantlet. The tungsten carbide core punched through the curved cast steel and detonated the ammunition stored directly beneath the gun breech. The Panther exploded, its turret lifting slightly from the force of the secondary detonation before crashing back down on the hull. The Sherman crew never saw the result. Their muzzle blast had kicked up a wall of fog and dirt that completely obscured their view. For 8 seconds, they sat in their tank, hearing but not seeing the explosion, not knowing if they had achieved a kill or merely damaged the Panther's gun. Only as the obscuration dissipated did they confirm the catastrophic kill. 2 more Panthers emerged from the fog in quick succession. The American crews engaged both. The tungsten rounds struck home. Both Panthers were destroyed within seconds, their crews having no time to effectively return fire in the limited visibility. The remaining German tanks in that column turned away, their crews shocked by the sudden loss of 3 Panzers to what they had been told were inferior American tanks. Throughout the morning of September 19th, similar engagements erupted across the Aracourt sector. American tanks, using the fog as concealment, engaged Panthers at ranges where HVAP rounds were most effective. The German tactical deployment proved disastrous. Advancing in column without proper reconnaissance, Panther crews repeatedly exposed their thinner side armor to American flanking fire. But the fog that had protected American Shermans from being spotted at range also created a new problem. Every time a Sherman fired its 76mm gun, the muzzle blast added more obscuration to an already visibility-limited battlefield. Crews found themselves firing, then waiting in blind uncertainty for 8 to 30 seconds as dust and fog slowly cleared, hoping their shot had penetrated, hoping no German tank was taking aim at their position during those blind seconds. Near Aracourt's command post, a platoon of M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, also equipped with 76mm guns and HVAP ammunition, engaged German armor at close range. The fast-moving tank destroyers proved devastatingly effective, but they too suffered from the muzzle blast problem. After each shot, crews had to rely on infantry observers to confirm hits while they sat unable to see the results of their fire. By noon, as the morning fog lifted, the tactical picture transformed. American forward artillery observers could now coordinate fire with defending tank companies. P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers of the 405th Fighter Group arrived overhead, diving through gaps in the cloud cover to strike German armor with rockets and machine guns. The combination of American advantages became overwhelmingly clear. While the Panther possessed superior armor and firepower as an individual weapon system, American forces employed combined arms tactics as standard doctrine. German tanks advanced without adequate artillery support, without air cover, without infantry to clear American defensive positions. American forces coordinated armor with artillery, air power, infantry, and tank destroyers in an integrated system that overwhelmed German technical advantages. When Panthers encountered these prepared defenses, they were destroyed piecemeal, despite their superior capabilities in tank versus tank comparison. The HVAP ammunition did not make Sherman tanks equal to Panthers in technical specifications. Warfare is not conducted according to technical specifications alone. Tanks are destroyed by crews who exploit vulnerabilities under combat conditions, by artillery that damages optics and kills exposed commanders, by airstrikes that catch columns on approach roads. The Panther's gun mantlet, necessary to allow the 75mm gun to elevate and traverse, created a weak point. The junction between turret and hull, the side armor, the engine deck, all represented targets that HVAP-equipped Shermans could now engage successfully at combat ranges that previously had been suicidal. But perhaps most devastating to German morale was the psychological impact of discovering their armor was no longer invulnerable. Panther crews had been trained to believe their tanks could not be penetrated frontally by American fire. Intelligence briefings emphasized the Sherman's inadequate firepower. Crews were told that as long as they kept the front toward the enemy, they were safe. The first Panther commanders to watch Sherman rounds punch through their mantlets and detonate ready ammunition learned otherwise. Those who survived such encounters carried that knowledge back to their units, spreading awareness that American tanks now possessed ammunition capable of defeating Panthers frontally. By the afternoon of September 19th, German tank commanders were reporting to headquarters that American Shermans possessed new, more powerful ammunition. The reports were confused and contradictory. Some claimed the Americans had secretly deployed tank destroyers with 90mm guns. Others suggested the British had provided 17-pounder Firefly tanks to American units. The truth that American industry had developed specialized ammunition that partially negated the Panthers' armor advantage was more troubling to German planners than any of these theories. It meant that American industrial capacity could respond to tactical problems faster than German industry could counter them. The fighting continued through September 22nd when the major German offensive efforts finally stalled. American forces had destroyed or disabled approximately 86 German tanks and assault guns. American losses stood at 25 Sherman tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The kill ratio heavily favored the Americans despite their technical disadvantage in individual tank performance. But these numbers obscured a more complex tactical reality. Many of those American tank losses occurred during the critical seconds after firing, when muzzle blast left crews blind and vulnerable. After-action reports documented multiple instances where Sherman crews fired HVAP rounds that successfully penetrated Panther armor, only to be destroyed by return fire from other German tanks, while still unable to see through the dust cloud their own shot had created. Sergeant Francis Baker's experience on November 20th, 1944, illustrated both the potential and the deadly limitations of HVAP ammunition in actual combat. His Sherman, equipped with a 76mm gun and carrying 6 HVAP rounds, engaged a Panther at approximately 800 yards. The range was within the theoretical effectiveness envelope for tungsten rounds. Baker's gunner fired. The muzzle blast kicked up a massive dust cloud. For 12 seconds, the crew sat blind, hearing the round impact but unable to observe the result. When visibility cleared, Baker saw the Panther was still operational. His shot had struck the side armor at an oblique angle. The tungsten core had shattered on impact without penetrating. The Panther was traversing its gun toward Baker's position. Baker's gunner fired again. Another HVAP round. Another wall of dust. This time, when the obscuration cleared, the Panther was withdrawing from the engagement rather than continuing the fight. Baker's crew had fired 2 of their precious 6 HVAP rounds and achieved only a tactical success, forcing the enemy to disengage without confirming a kill. The engagement demonstrated that even HVAP, even within effective range, required proper shot placement and favorable angles. The 8-second blindness after each shot meant crews often could not immediately correct their aim if the first round missed or failed to penetrate. The German perspective on these engagements was one of confusion and bitter recrimination. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered battle with approximately 90 tanks and assault guns, could muster fewer than 20 operational vehicles by September 29th. German after-action reports struggled to explain the defeat. The technical superiority of the Panther was undeniable on paper. How had inexperienced crews in newly produced tanks been defeated so comprehensively? The answers lay partly in training and experience. The Panzer Brigade crews had minimal training, often arriving at the front with only weeks of instruction on their vehicles. American tank crews in the 4th Armored Division were veterans who had fought across France, understood combined arms warfare, and had learned to read terrain for tactical advantage. But training alone did not fully explain Panther losses, particularly the penetrations that should not have been possible with standard American ammunition. German intelligence officers examining destroyed Panthers found entry holes smaller than expected, suggesting a sub-caliber projectile. Examination of unexploded rounds recovered near disabled tanks revealed the truth. The Americans had deployed tungsten carbide ammunition. This discovery had profound strategic implications. Germany itself had developed similar ammunition, the Panzer Granit 40, which used tungsten cores to improve penetration. But German tungsten supplies were critically limited by late 1944, with production focused on machine tools rather than ammunition. If Americans could field specialized tungsten carbide ammunition in quantities sufficient to distribute to frontline tank units, it demonstrated industrial capacity and resource access that Germany could not match. Not only were American tanks more numerous and better supported logistically, they were now equipped with ammunition that partially negated Germany's carefully engineered technical advantages in armor protection. But German intelligence also noted something else in their examination of battlefield wreckage. Multiple Panthers showed evidence of having been hit multiple times before being destroyed. Some showed 2 or 3 impact points on the mantlet or turret face, suggesting American gunners had fired, been unable to confirm the kill through muzzle blast obscuration, and fired again once visibility returned. This pattern indicated a vulnerability in American tank gunnery that German commanders believed could be exploited. If American crews were blind for 8 to 30 seconds after firing, Panther crews who survived the initial hit had a window of opportunity to return fire before the Sherman could take evasive action or fire again. Orders went out to Panther commanders, emphasizing the importance of immediate counterfire. If hit but not disabled, traverse the gun toward the enemy position immediately. Fire while the American crew is still blind from their own muzzle blast. This German tactical adjustment created a new dynamic in subsequent armored engagements. American tank commanders became acutely aware that firing an HVAP round was not merely a ballistic calculation, but a gamble with survival. The 8-second blindness meant they had to trust that their first shot achieved either a catastrophic kill or at minimum disabled the enemy's ability to return fire. Some crews developed tactics to mitigate this vulnerability. One Sherman would fire while another maintained observation, ready to engage if the first shot failed to destroy the target. But this required close coordination and exposed both tanks to enemy fire. Another tactic involved firing and immediately reversing into cover, accepting complete blindness but gaining protection during those vulnerable seconds. But terrain did not always offer such options, and reversing blind risked backing into obstacles or other American vehicles. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 brought these tactical tensions to crisis point. German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, with hundreds of Panthers and Tiger tanks deployed in winter conditions that favored defensive fighting. Poor weather limited Allied air superiority for the first critical days of the offensive. American Sherman crews relied heavily on their scarce HVAP ammunition to engage German heavy armor. The shortage became critical within days of heavy fighting. Some units exhausted their HVAP supply completely during the first week and found resupply requests going unfulfilled as logistical networks struggled to deliver ammunition through snow-blocked roads disrupted by German advances. Crews who had grown accustomed to having at least a few HVAP rounds available for emergencies found themselves facing Panthers with only standard armor-piercing ammunition that they knew from bitter experience would bounce off frontal armor at any range. Lieutenant James Bates of the 7th Armored Division recorded in his diary an engagement on December 19th that captured the desperation of this tactical situation. His Sherman platoon encountered 3 Panthers in a snow-covered field at approximately 600 yards. They had 2 HVAP rounds total among the 4 tanks in his platoon. Bates made the decision to close to 300 yards before firing, accepting the risk of operating within the Panthers' lethal engagement envelope in order to maximize the probability that the HVAP rounds would penetrate. His lead tank fired. The muzzle blast threw up a wall of snow that completely obscured the battlefield. For 23 seconds, measured by Bates checking his watch, the American crews could see nothing. They heard the sharp crack of a Panther's gun firing. One of Bates's Shermans was hit, the round penetrating the turret and killing the gunner. When the snow finally settled, Bates saw that the first HVAP round had achieved a kill. The Panther was burning, but the delay in confirming that kill had cost an American tank and crew member. The other 2 Panthers were withdrawing. This engagement encapsulated the terrible mathematics that American tank commanders faced throughout the winter campaign. HVAP gave them the ability to hurt Panthers frontally, but the 8 to 30-second blindness after firing meant they often paid a price for that capability. German tank commanders learned to exploit this window. After-action interviews with captured Panther commanders revealed they had been specifically instructed to count seconds after observing an American tank fire. If the Panther survived the hit, the commander would call out the count. 3, 4, 5 seconds. The loader would be slamming another round into the breech. 6, 7, 8 seconds. The gunner would be laying the gun on the last observed position of the Sherman. The American crew would still be blind, unable to see that death was traversing toward them through the dissipating dust cloud. Yet even in the difficult fighting of the Ardennes, American forces demonstrated that tactical skill and combined arms coordination could compensate for technical disadvantages, and even for the vulnerability created by muzzle blast. Tank crews coordinated closely with infantry, using bazooka teams to disable Panthers from close range, while Shermans provided covering fire. Artillery forward observers called in time-on-target missions that damaged optics, disabled tracks, and killed exposed crew members even when shells could not penetrate armor. Air support, when weather finally permitted in late December and January, proved devastatingly effective against German armor concentrated on approach roads. The Battle of the Bulge ended with German armored forces shattered, having lost hundreds of irreplaceable tanks and experienced crews in an offensive that failed to reach its objectives despite achieving complete tactical surprise. By early 1945, the strategic picture had shifted decisively and irreversibly in Allied favor. American and British forces were preparing to cross the Rhine. Soviet armies were advancing from the east, having shattered German defensive lines in massive winter offensives. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under combined strategic bombing, loss of territory containing critical resources and manufacturing facilities, and severe shortages of raw materials including fuel and tungsten. Panther production, which had reached 3,900 units in 1944, fell sharply in early 1945 as factories were bombed, transportation networks disrupted, and raw materials became unavailable. Even when Panthers were produced, fuel shortages often kept them immobile. German tank units in the final months frequently abandoned tanks not because of combat damage, but because they had no fuel to operate them. The technical limitations of HVAP ammunition, while less publicized than its successes, deserve examination for historical completeness. The tungsten carbide core, while excellent at penetrating armor when conditions were favorable, had fundamental material science limitations. The brittleness that made tungsten effective also made it fragile under certain impact conditions. When striking armor at velocities below approximately 2,300 feet per second, or when hitting at extreme oblique angles, the core could shatter rather than penetrating. This meant that crews needed to understand not just whether their target was within range, but whether their angle of approach and estimated range would result in sufficient impact velocity for the tungsten core to remain intact during penetration. Few crews received formal training on these complex variables, most learned through combat experience. Technical reports from the Ballistics Research Laboratory, analyzing recovered HVAP projectiles that had failed to penetrate, revealed the extent of this problem. At ranges beyond 1,200 yards, approximately 60% of HVAP rounds fired at Panther mantlets either shattered on impact or ricocheted without penetrating. This failure rate remained largely unknown to frontline crews who believed, based on briefings, that HVAP was effective against mantlets at up to 1,000 yards. The discrepancy between theoretical penetration under ideal test conditions and actual battlefield performance created situations where crews expended precious HVAP rounds at ranges where success was statistically unlikely. The 8-second blindness after firing meant they often could not immediately observe that their round had failed to penetrate and adjust their tactics accordingly. By the time visibility returned, the tactical situation had often changed, with enemy tanks relocating or returning fire. The post-war analysis of HVAP ammunition revealed both its successes and its limitations with clinical precision. Against the Panther's gun mantlet at ranges up to 1,000 meters, HVAP was highly effective when hits were achieved, reliably penetrating and often causing catastrophic secondary explosions. Against the glacis plate, results were poor except at very close ranges and favorable angles. The extreme slope meant that tungsten carbide rounds traveling at high velocity often ricocheted or shattered on impact. This meant Sherman crews still needed to maneuver for advantageous shot angles, flanking Panthers when tactically possible, rather than relying on HVAP to provide a frontal penetration capability against all aspects of the tank. The ammunition did not make Sherman tanks technical equals to Panthers. It gave American crews a fighting chance in engagements where previously they had little hope of frontal penetration. But that chance came with the tactical cost of 8 to 30 seconds of blindness, during which German crews could, if they survived, return fire. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, provided another combat test of HVAP effectiveness under very different circumstances. American Sherman tanks, now primarily the M4A3E8 variant armed with 76mm guns, faced Soviet-built T-34-85 tanks in North Korean and later Chinese service. Unlike the situation in Europe where HVAP had been critically scarce, by 1950 tungsten supplies were no longer constrained by competing wartime demands and substantial stocks were readily available. American tank crews in Korea found that HVAP rounds easily penetrated T-34-85 armor at normal combat ranges. The T-34-85, while capable, possessed armor protection significantly inferior to the Panther. Its 90mm thick turret front and 45mm thick glacis plate could not resist tungsten carbide projectiles fired at high velocity from 76mm guns. American Shermans in Korea achieved remarkably favorable exchange ratios against communist armor, due partly to superior crew training and better gun optics, but also significantly to the plentiful availability of HVAP ammunition. Tank commanders no longer had to ration their tungsten rounds or make agonizing decisions about when to expend them. They could fire HVAP as their primary anti-tank ammunition, but the muzzle blast problem remained. Korean battlefields, particularly in summer, were often dusty. The 76mm gun still kicked up obscuring clouds that left crews blind for critical seconds. The difference was that T-34 crews, with their slower reload times and generally less experienced personnel, were less able to exploit that window of vulnerability than German Panther crews had been. The vindication of the 76mm Sherman in Korea was bittersweet for veterans of European combat. The ammunition that could have been more widely employed in Europe proved devastatingly effective in Asia, when supply constraints no longer limited employment, and when facing an enemy less able to exploit American tactical vulnerabilities. The German perspective on American HVAP ammunition, gathered from post-war interrogations and examination of captured documents, revealed grudging professional respect and deep frustration. German ordnance officers recognized that American industry had solved the tungsten core ammunition problem more successfully than German manufacturers. Despite Germany having pioneered the underlying technology with the Panzer Granit 40 series, production limitations meant these rounds were never available in sufficient quantities. American production of HVAP, though also limited by tungsten scarcity, still exceeded German capability substantially by late 1944. German tank crews interviewed after the war frequently mentioned American ammunition improvements as a significant factor that complicated their tactical situation. The knowledge that Sherman tanks could penetrate Panther mantlets at combat ranges meant German crews could not simply rely on frontal armor for protection. But German crews also noted, with some satisfaction, that American gunners seemed reluctant to exploit their HVAP ammunition's full potential. Multiple German tank commanders reported observing American Shermans that fired once, then withdrew or remained static for extended periods rather than firing again quickly. At first, German intelligence interpreted this as American crews being overly cautious or poorly trained. Only later did analysis of the 76mm gun's characteristics reveal the muzzle blast problem. German reports noted that American crews were not being cautious but blind, unable to see through the dust clouds their own guns created. Some German tactical guidance suggested that Panther crews who survived an initial hit should immediately fire smoke rounds toward the American position to further extend the period of obscuration and visual confusion, denying the Sherman crew the ability to see clearly even after their muzzle blast dissipated. Whether this tactic was widely employed remains unclear from available records, but its suggestion indicates German commanders understood and sought to exploit the 8-second vulnerability window. Technical analysis of HVAP projectiles recovered from German tank wrecks provided German engineers with detailed understanding of American ammunition design. The tungsten carbide core, surrounded by lightweight aluminum body sections, represented efficient use of scarce strategic materials that maximized penetrating power while minimizing tungsten consumption per round. The lightweight carrier body allowed higher velocities without excessive barrel wear, while the dense tungsten core retained kinetic energy over distance far better than steel penetrators. German engineers recognized these advantages but lacked the industrial capacity and material resources to respond with similar developments at scale. By late 1944, German tank and ammunition production focused entirely on maintaining output of existing designs rather than developing new ammunition types. The Panther's KOK 42 75mm gun already possessed excellent penetrating power with standard ammunition against Allied tanks, so developing improved German rounds was not the critical priority that developing HVAP had been for American forces. The Battle of Arcourt's historical significance extended far beyond immediate tactical results. The engagement proved conclusively that American armored doctrine, emphasizing mobility, combined arms coordination, superior logistics, and overwhelming material support could consistently defeat German tactical methods, relying heavily on superior individual tank performance. German commanders had designed their 1944 Panzer brigades around the Panther's technical capabilities, assuming armor and firepower would compensate for inexperienced crews and limited support. This assumption proved catastrophically false. The lesson was clear to military observers on both sides. Technical excellence in weapons design mattered and provided advantages, but operational excellence in combined arms warfare, superior logistics, and better training mattered more for achieving tactical and operational success. The impact of HVAP ammunition on individual tank crews deserves consideration beyond purely technical analysis. For American tankers who had faced Panthers with only standard ammunition during the difficult Normandy fighting, the arrival of HVAP represented tangible hope. The ammunition did not eliminate the Panther threat, and the 8-second blindness it created added new tactical complications. But it provided a tool that offered reasonable chances of achieving penetration under favorable circumstances. This psychological boost contributed to improved performance and more aggressive tactics. For German tankers, the knowledge that American tanks now posed a credible frontal threat fundamentally altered tactical calculations. Otto Carius, a highly decorated German tank ace who commanded Tiger tanks and survived the war, wrote extensively in his post-war memoirs about the psychological impact of facing enemies who could penetrate his armor. The sense of invulnerability that thick armor provided was crucial to crew morale and aggressive tactics. When that sense eroded, crew performance suffered measurably. Panther crews facing HVAP-equipped Shermans experienced this erosion of confidence. The mantlet became a known vulnerability that competent American crews could exploit, even though doing so left them blind and vulnerable for critical seconds. This knowledge made Panther crews demonstrably more cautious, slower to engage, and generally less willing to take tactical risks. But defensive warfare yielded initiative to American forces, allowing them to employ combined arms tactics that negated German advantages. The psychological impact of losing armor invulnerability contributed to the increasingly defensive mindset that characterized German armored operations in 1945, even when German tanks still possessed technical superiority in armor protection and gun penetration against most targets. The strategic implications of HVAP development extend to broader questions about technological power and competition in modern warfare and the crucial importance of industrial capacity. Both American and German research establishments possessed competent engineers and sophisticated understanding of ballistics and armor penetration. Both recognized the value of tungsten carbide ammunition early in the war. Both developed functional designs. The critical difference came down to industrial capacity and resource availability rather than scientific knowledge. American industry could produce HVAP in quantities sufficient to influence battlefield outcomes meaningfully, though never enough to fully equip all units. German industry could barely produce enough to conduct testing. This pattern repeated across numerous weapon systems throughout the war. Germany developed sophisticated and often technically superior weapons, but could not produce them in quantities that affected strategic outcomes. American industrial capacity produced less sophisticated but highly effective equipment in overwhelming numbers. M4 Sherman was objectively not the best tank of World War II by most technical measures, but American factories produced approximately 49,324 of them, compared to approximately 6,132 Panthers. This 8-to-1 production ratio, combined with ammunition improvements like HVAP that reduced the technical gap, proved strategically decisive. The development cost of HVAP, both in scarce tungsten and in the engineering effort required, was substantial. But that investment provided American tank crews with a weapon that transformed tactical engagements from hopeless to competitive. The muzzle blast problem remained an unsolved tactical liability throughout the war, creating the 8-second window of vulnerability that gave this ammunition its double-edged character. Crews could hurt Panthers, but had to survive the blindness that followed. The post-war careers of veterans who fought at Aracourt and subsequent engagements reflect the enduring impact of these combat experiences on military thinking. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who commanded the 37th Tank Battalion at Aracourt with distinction, rose to become United States Army Chief of Staff and gave his name to the M1 Abrams main battle tank. The lessons Abrams learned about combined arms warfare, the critical importance of crew training, and the necessity of adequate ammunition influenced his entire career and the doctrine he helped develop. The M1 Abrams was deliberately designed with a powerful 120mm smoothbore gun and sophisticated ammunition types, including depleted uranium penetrators, that serve functionally the same role HVAP served in World War II. But the M1 also incorporated advanced fire control systems and stabilization that allowed crews to fire accurately while moving, eliminating the need to stop and accept blindness while assessing results. German veterans of Panther units who survived the war and later joined the West German Bundeswehr brought different but equally important lessons. They had personally experienced the limitations of possessing technological superiority without the industrial base and logistics to support it. Bundeswehr armor doctrine during the Cold War emphasized quality and training, while explicitly recognizing that West Germany could not match Soviet numerical superiority. But Bundeswehr planners, informed by wartime experience, also emphasized ammunition effectiveness. The Leopard 1 and later Leopard 2 main battle tanks used sophisticated ammunition designs, informed by the realization that ammunition technology and crew training mattered as much as armor thickness. The memory of watching tungsten rounds from inferior American tanks penetrate supposedly invulnerable Panther armor shaped how German engineers approached post-war tank design. The conclusion of World War II in Europe, marked by Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, ended the immediate tactical need for HVAP ammunition against Panthers. American ordnance officers systematically examining destroyed vehicles found clear evidence of HVAP penetrations on some wrecks, confirming the ammunition's effectiveness under favorable conditions while noting its limitations. Panthers hit by HVAP typically showed penetrations through the mantlet or turret face when struck at favorable angles, but rarely through the glacis plate, which remained highly resistant. This pattern validated American tactical doctrine that emphasized flanking maneuvers and creating favorable engagement angles, rather than relying solely on ammunition to overcome armor advantages. The comprehensive post-war analysis concluded that while HVAP meaningfully improved Sherman capabilities against heavy German armor, the truly decisive factors remained overwhelming numerical superiority, vastly better logistics, complete air superiority, superior artillery support, and more effective operational doctrine. The transformation of American tank crews from mid-1944 to early 1945 reflected the cumulative impact of combat experience, improved equipment availability, and familiarity with specialized ammunition, including HVAP. Crews that landed in Normandy in June 1944 often felt genuinely apprehensive about facing German armor, particularly Panthers and Tigers. By early 1945, after months of sustained combat, significant training improvements, increased availability of 76mm Shermans, and growing familiarity with HVAP ammunition despite its limitations, American tankers approached engagements far more confidently. This psychological shift had direct tactical consequences. Confident crews fought more aggressively, took calculated risks when opportunities appeared, and exploited tactical advantages. While HVAP ammunition alone did not create this transformation, its availability and proven effectiveness, balanced against the known 8-second vulnerability it created, contributed meaningfully to improved American armored force morale and tactical performance. The legacy of HVAP development continues influencing modern ammunition design. American armor doctrine from 1945 onward consistently emphasized ammunition effectiveness as a critical component of tank design. Modern tank ammunition uses depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators, materials chosen for essentially the same density and hardness properties that made tungsten carbide effective in World War II. The underlying principle remains constant: concentrate maximum kinetic energy into a small, extremely dense projectile, moving at the highest achievable velocity. The continuity from 1944 HVAP to present-day armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot ammunition illustrates how foundational lessons from World War II continue directly influencing military technology. Soviet and later Russian tank ammunition development followed remarkably similar paths, independently recognizing that armor-piercing capability depends heavily on projectile material properties and kinetic energy delivery. September 19, 1944, when First Lieutenant Merwin Menn's Sherman crews first engaged Panthers with HVAP ammunition at Aracourt, marked a genuine turning point in the psychological balance of armored warfare. German crews who had fought confidently behind their armor learned that American tanks could pose a serious frontal threat, though that threat came with a tactical cost. American crews who had felt outmatched gained meaningful confidence from knowing they possessed ammunition that could defeat Panthers under favorable circumstances, even though firing it left them blind and vulnerable for 8 to 30 seconds. This shift in tactical psychology, enabled by tungsten carbide ammunition produced in American factories, influenced every subsequent armored engagement of the European War. The crews who fired those first HVAP rounds in combat, watching tungsten cores punch through armor that had seemed invincible, then sitting in blind uncertainty while muzzle blast obscured the battlefield, demonstrated that industrial capacity and material science, applied intelligently to urgent tactical problems, could overcome seemingly insurmountable technical disadvantages. But they also demonstrated that technological solutions rarely come without tactical costs. The 8 seconds of blindness that followed each shot represented a vulnerability that German crews learned to exploit when they survived. American tank commanders had to weigh the power of HVAP against the risk of those blind seconds, making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information under combat stress. That some chose to fire anyway, accepting the risk, speaks to the courage of men who understood both the potential and the limitations of their weapons. The fundamental lesson learned at considerable cost on battlefields across Europe remains directly relevant for military planners facing technological challenges of modern warfare. Superior technology matters, but only when available in sufficient quantities, employed by properly trained crews who understand both capabilities and limitations, and integrated into doctrine that exploits advantages while mitigating vulnerabilities. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.